because it's always been a problem, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, when people have become very materialist, very naturalistic, want to reject sort of God, want to evict God from all sorts of domains of knowledge. And you as a transcendentalist, you push at that point and saying, how can you say within your worldview that there is logic, that there is structure, that there is meaning, that there is, because you look at, say, something like deconstructionism or the consequences of, if you say yes, the postmodern view was very much, there is nothing, it's all socially defined, it's all arbitrary, it's all relativistic, there is no certainty, there is no truth, and you end up with philosophy collapsing into anti-philosophy. In a sense, it's actually saying, well, our final conclusion is that there is no rhyme, there is no reason, there is no grounding for logic. It's all arbitrary. It's just something that might be useful to us. It's all instruments. But you get people that push and push and push and push, and eventually the result of your philosophy is that you're actually saying, well, there can't be any philosophy. There is nothing that gives us coherence. There's just a random multiverse of unrelated contingent things happening. And so the idea of transcendentalism, in a sense, when you say, well, you're trying to say, well, actually, no, they're not random. The reason why we can talk about laws of nature, or the reason why we can have discussions about causality, the reason that we can unravel the riddle of induction, the reason why we provide a grounding for sort of why we can consider, why we can generate the conditions that allow a legitimate, say, pragmatic approach, what we can justify, say, the principles that a pragmatist might use, or we can actually answer the question, well, what is better, what is good, what is beneficial for society. We provide transcendentals which legitimately give us a basis for using, say these are what is beneficial, this would be good. We believe that because we have some sort of transcendental basis for they're not just arbitrary, and we would never advocate, say, building tower blocks on a pragmatic basis, because there is nowhere in, say, in the Christian worldview where say scripture or the history of would suggest that is a way, that is the best way for people to live. And that's what we're sort of saying. We're saying that our transcendental justification for establishing those principles comes from the transcendental of the Christian understanding of God. So the Trinity becomes the transcendental that ultimately resolves, say, the problem of universals and particulars. That is one of the I think we studied in the last talk. I was talking about Frege and how he had the concept of non natural entities of number. So there were like things that existed. They were non-physical. Sorry, that's a better way of saying it. Is that they were non-physical, but they were real. So the concepts existed and that was one of the most forceful and radical and revolutionary attempts to try and resolve this problem of particular and universal, of actually saying the universal was actually a real entity that existed, but it wasn't natural, it wasn't part of the natural world. And so the physical world, I keep getting those two terms are distinct. It's better to say the physical world. So they were non-real, non-physical, but they were real. And so non-natural, we it's difficult to use these words without importing in a lot of philosophical balance there. But that idea of the universal as existing, but being non-physical. So part of, if you like, part of what was real, but not part of what we would call nature. And but the problem was that his view, he then said, well, that view then led in the analytic movement led into the logical positive view of, and so his resolution of that problem of the universe and the particular which governed the language was a reflection of the objects of reality, and we are directly in contact with those objects through our language. But that led to the rigorous and the constraints of the logical positivism, which, when you look at it, that was too tight, that was too rigid, and that ignores the vast swathe of human experience. And so that resolution of the problem of universal in particular fails at that point. Whereas with the Christian concept of the Trinity, of there being a unity, so three persons but one God, that's a perfect resolution of that problem. And so the idea of the concept of universality and the concept of particularity are resolved in this ultimate. It provides the ultimate transcendental, which allows you to generate a coherent philosophy from coherent first principles, because that's something else that happened within, particularly in modern philosophies, that people began to say that let's get away from this idea of first philosophy of there needing a foundation, some sort of foundation for knowledge. This idea of there being a first philosophy, only particulars exist. That was the whole empiricist emphasis, is that only particulars exist. And so that's just been a message that's flipped across the bottom of my screen from my wife. She's away in Japan at the moment, so I got distracted. Apologies there. And so the resolution of that universe and that particular allows you to generate, say, a coherent philosophy, and you haven't got all those unanswered questions. Whereas the 20th century, late 20th century approach to that problem was to say, well, there is no way we can resolve this problem. All we've got is this big massive multiverse of ideas. It's even come into say the common parlance now. People talk about multiverses appearing in a lot of films and stuff, isn't it? People are talking about the multiverse, whereas the concept of a universe was there was a fundamental unity between all the different branches of human knowledge. That there's a unifying principle. That's why universities were called universities, because it was trying to show that all these different aspects, all these different disciplines of human knowledge are fundamentally related at some point. And so for the Christian believer, for the ultimate aim of the Christian transcendentalist is to say there is this fundamental unifying principle that allows you to say that yes, there is a natural law. Why is there a natural law? Because the Lord has committed in His Word that there's certain principles within nature, and He said as long as day and night, summer and winter, heat and cold remain, then the world will remain. He commits, and He commits to this. He commits that the world will behave. In that provides you with a justification for induction, because there's no logical. Induction is always logically fallible, but the only way you can justify induction is that the regularity that we actually see in nature is not just something. It's not something that we just observe and we've ended up, but it's something that's guaranteed by the commitment that the Lord makes to the world. So So the great sort of like the great promise of the transcendental way of looking is by generating these principles that allow you to then rediscover this concept of the universe, of there being a rhyme and there being a reason, that things that aren't completely absurd, aren't completely socially defined. It provides a reason and a rationale. And so if I just reiterate, we started off talking about sort of proof, different concepts of proof, rational, empirical, if you like, leads you into inductive proofs, pragmatic proofs, and then transcendental proofs. The key aspect of a transcendental proof is that a transcendental proof isn't trying to prove, say, like an individual fact that you might be trying to argue about when you've got, say, like a particular instance, say, like with an inductive argument, or with a particular instance. If you were doing some sort of pragmatic approach to a particular problem, you're trying to give yourself a specific answer to a specific question. The best way to understand a transcendental argument is to actually trying to say what are you assuming in order to generate, to pose anything, to what is it in the concept question that how do you legitimize even the concept of being able to ask a question? Because it's almost like when you're asking a question, you're assuming there is an answer. If you're assuming there is an answer, that means that you're assuming something about the metaphysical character of reality. That's the ultimate challenge, and that's the ultimate challenge for this is why when Cornelius Van Til was talking about the sun is nearly around the corner, so I'm coming in and out of the sun here, which means that probably the videos are dark and then light. That was the ultimate thing for sort of like for Cornelius Van Til when he was discussing this sort of like problem. He was saying it's not so much what theory of reality are you having to assume in order to generate even a concept of proof. So the transcendental question about proofs is not you can have a deductive proof, or you can have an inductive proof, or you can have a pragmatic proof, or you can. It's rather the question. The transcendental question is, what do you mean? What theory of reality do you have to assume in order to even have the concept of proof? What are you assuming about reality when you are when you're even wanting to say that you can even have a proof? And that is why transcendental questions are so important, because they are dealing with your fundamental assumptions about reality. It's like your presuppositions about reality. What are the presuppositions of your worldview? There was a very famous philosopher of science in the 1960s, and his book is still considered one of the milestones in the philosophy of science. He was somebody called Kuhn, and it's called I think it's called Scientific Revolutions. Is it Scientific Revolutions? But he had this concept of paradigms, and he was saying you have a governing paradigm in different aspects in different eras of science, and instead of science being like a linear process of just building up on what people have previously done, what suddenly happens is that there's a dramatic change, like the change from, say, Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. They're not reconcilable in any fundamental way. They're totally different. Their basic presuppositions are different. And so this idea of presuppositions, and in the work of Quine also, the idea that Quine was saying, well, you have a general theory of the world that you bring to the problem, and it's you can't discuss or move outside or generate any kind of argument about, unless you are presupposing a particular view of the world. Now, he was very relativistic in a way in which he said you can take the pick of any empirically sufficient theory. You don't. He's not. But he was saying that. So because of the under-attestation of his formal way of saying it was the under-attestation of a theory, you can never come to a comprehensive theory about the world that would be able to supply you all the answers about the world unless you had already had all the data about the world. It was his famous holism. But he was saying that to the degree of usefulness of a theory, if your theory is gives you a reasonable empirical prediction about what you're trying to solve, then it's valid. So he was saying your theory of nature, as long as it's empirically sufficient for whatever the problem was, it's perfectly okay to have that theory or somebody else to have another theory if it's empirically sufficient for them. So, and that obviously is very relativistic, and it was the same with Kuhn. Really, he was actually saying, well, you can have all these different paradigms that might be okay for a particular time, but then suddenly it becomes inadequate and a new science comes out, and so you end up with all these sort of particularly views of a view of knowledge that is very fluid and very non-normative. There's no, you can never be certain about anything. You're always understanding, there's always this degree of fallibility and uncertainty, and you then have the problem as to say, well, why is your way, those are your fundamental paradigms, your fundamental presuppositions of life. So that was where this term paradigm really came into, say, modern philosophy and a modern philosophy of science, a philosophy of language. It was a very influential concept when you're governing paradigm. The challenge then really becomes, well, how do all these competing paradigms of understanding and of life and of worldviews, conceptual schemes, how do all these competitors, how do you decide between the truth of these and, or can any of them ever be true? Are they just adequate, like Quine says? Well, these are just, you can have a view of nature and it can be any of many. Whereas what the Transcendentalists, particularly, and as I work through my work, what I'm actually trying to demonstrate is that when you look at worldviews, when you take the Transcendental argument to, well, what you're assuming, the point I was trying to get to about 50 minutes ago, I think, was that Cornelius Van Til would say that a summary of the Transcendental argument with regards to God would be to say atheism assumes theism. He used to just sort of point at one of his students and say, unpack that for me. And so the basic assumption, what you're trying to actually say here is that in order to use logic, in order to generate an argument, in order to be rational, in order to come to any sort of conclusion that an atheist would want to generate about God, is that the very structures of the thought that allows you to come up with an atheistic argument is only possible because you've assumed what theism, the principles of theism. You're using the transcendentals, which are generated by a theistic view, in order to generate your atheistic argument, and that is a very, very, very powerful view, powerful argument, because it's very hard to refute that particular argument. Because if you think one of the most famous atheists of the or who thought through whether or not they were a thoroughgoing atheist at the end of their life is of interest. But one of the most famous philosophers was Jean-Paul Sartre, and he is famous in also he started off in Sorbonne. He taught philosophy, and then he left academic philosophy, but he became one of the most famous philosophers of that period, in particular of the mid I think maybe early 30s he started merging, but he was very famous during the 1960s, and he conducted the war trials after the Second World War with Russell, Bertrand Russell. They didn't have any legal standing, but there were war crime trials against the atrocities of the United States. But he, in his autobiography, which is just called Words, he was very famous because he was an amazing literary figure. He could write amazing plays, but he, in his writing, he eventually gets to the point where he realizes that if you follow through the presuppositions of atheism, Nietzsche had this insight as well. If you follow through the presuppositions of atheism, you end up destroying your own philosophy. It's like he wrote something very, very poignant. He sort of like said, he said, I found the Holy Ghost in the cellar, and I had to throw him out. And he said because he said that if he wrote, what he meant by that was that if he was writing something and the aim of that writing was to convince other people, that meant he assumed that there was some rational structure of the world, there was some logical structures of the world, it was possible to reach people, there was some sort of structure outside of himself that he was assuming. And so he was, because he eventually got to the point where he was saying that, he said, I used to think my pen was a sword, but now I realise how helpless we are. So he was actually saying that his whole entire profession, what had motivated him for his entire life, why he wrote, what motivated him to write, was he actually realised that what was actually motivating him to write, what was behind, what his presuppositions for even wanting to write were based on this something that was in his cellar of his life, which was this post-Christian assumption. He was operating on Christian assumptions when he was writing what he was trying to write, when he was trying to, he said that he remained a Marxist throughout his whole life. But I think he left the Communist Party. I think he wasn't a member of the Communist Party for very long after the Second World War, I think. But he said that he was still a Marxist, but he was an existentialist. I mean, that was what he was famous for. He wasn't famous as, say, like an expositor of Marxism. He was famous as an existentialist. But he realized, as Nietzsche did, because Nietzsche's one of his famous is the madman rushing into the square, saying, I've killed God, because he said, I think he writes somewhere, I hear that what I'm trying to remember. I hear that we don't believe in God, but or that I believe I'll have to paraphrase it, can't remember the exact phrase. But it says, I hear we don't believe in God, but we still believe in grammar. And what he was trying to say there was that the idea of order, of relation, Noam Chomsky picks this up in his Depth Grammar. He was saying there seems to be this underlying structure in language, which seems to be, and what's more is it seems to be common to all languages. And so that whole idea of their, Nietzsche sort of like realised that even believing in grammar, the concept of grammar is assuming an order, and it's assuming an origin, and a, if you like, a transcendental, which is coming, an organising principle, which had been provided, which had been put into philosophy because of the theistic assumption, and particularly in his thought, it had come into the West because of as a post-Christian thing. The assumption was a Christian assumption of there being order, structure, laws of nature. Those things that had existed. In a sense, we often go back to sort of like to ancient Greece and the Renaissance, and people that had made empirical observations about the world. But what was in the sense was unique about the Christian view is that it provided a coherence it gave a justification for the laws of nature from the books of Genesis all the way through. It's like a coherent, internally coherent view that has generated. It caused a radical change when the Reformation came to the world, and that way of thinking affected not just sort of Christian cultures but it went into the Islamic world and into nations that, even though they have a different religion, they've nevertheless been influenced by Western pattern of thought, which were based in the Reformation understanding that provided, because of the transcendentals of the Christian transcendentals of the Trinity, that gave us laws of nature, predictability, causality, all these different aspects that provide us with a strong logical and the ability to generate objectivity rather than just collapsing into subjectivity. That's the power of the transcendental approach, in the sense that you're being able to recover some sort of objectivity, which the history of 20th century philosophy should show us is that the great phenomenological movement, which that tried to recover some sort of objectivity, but it then degenerated into existentialism, which says no, we can't have any objectivity. It's always subjectivity, and the role of in the sense of the subject and the person in the second half of the 20th century in philosophy and particularly in the postmodern view, where everything is subjective and it's all filtered through us. There's not even the possibility of that there could be the objective. The great promise of the transcendental approach of the Christian structure is that it gives you the reason why we have to look back and say, why did the Reformation have such an enormous impact on the world? Is because it made possible, it gave like a justification for determinism, it gave a justification for the laws of nature. People weren't, there were no longer sort of like the teleological explanations that derived from Aristotelism and scholasticism. Natural science relied on this sort of principle of induction, and one of the great achievements of the Reformation was to have a rule of the world that was predictable. There were certain principles that God had put into the world. There was a concept of God as somebody that followed his own rules, that followed his own laws, that it wasn't as if God could just decide and was committed. There was like a covenant. There was a covenant commitment, a very strong commitment. He said, "I've made this covenant with the day and the night, and with the heavens and the earth." That there was like a covenant. God was committing himself to there being a particular way of the world working,